Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, who is this great sage preaching from the vulture's peak?
He is a man of many names and titles. He is a man and he is everyone. He is the truth speaking itself to itself, and he is a teacher. Like us, he was born to two parents, but he is of three bodies, and he is of infinite form and mind. Wherever he is a realm of purity and truth for as long as he is there. Wherever he has been, celebrates his having been there.
Is he human or is he divine?
What's the difference? Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. Today we'll be discussing who the Buddha was and what he is in the Buddhist religion. We will be discussing whether or not he is a god, an object of worship, or a creator, prophet like Jesus or Mohammed. We will discuss what it means to be a Buddha and who can become one and who can't. I hope you enjoy it.
All right, so first, the big question. Who is the Buddha?
It's a big question and a good question. The Buddha that we often talk about is a historical figure. He was the prince that we discussed in episode 1, who was born in India and who renounced his royal life to become a great teacher of the Dharma. We'll discuss what the Dharma means in a moment. But in addition to that, the word Buddha is also a title. It's cognate with the word Bodh, B-O-D-H, in Sanskrit, which corresponds with awakened or awakening. The reason why there's a kind of tree called a Bodhi tree is because of the Buddha. He sat under that particular kind of tree when he became enlightened, and it's named after him. So the title Buddha is enlightened one or awakened one. A Buddha has fully realized enlightenment, and what that means is that he's had an insight into the non-arising of all dhammas. This is a complicated phrase, and we will definitely spend some time to unpack it. But the short version is a person who has become omniscient is a Buddha. Now, unpacking that phrase from before, non-arising of all dhammas. Let's start with the word dharma, because that's the non-English word that people will probably be the least familiar with. In Buddhism, dharma is a word that has at least 7 different meanings. And all these different meanings come up in the Buddhist canon, or the textual tradition of sutras and other texts. And these 7 different meanings have been measured and defined and looked at by all the current contemporary scholars. In this case, dharmas means something in reality. Happiness, cup.
This microphone I'm talking into.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So a dharma is just a physical thing? Like, is that how broadly we're going here?
It's physical things and all non-physical things. If it can be perceived by the mind, it's a dharma.
Okay, so the key portion here is the perception.
Exactly.
Something we can perceive. Okay.
So we can perceive feelings, we can perceive ideas, concepts, we can perceive cognition and metacognition. All of these things are dharmas, including all of the physical things in the world that we can sense with our physical senses. And in this case, all dharmas just speaks to everything that can be sensed and perceived, just everything in reality. So moving on to the other part, the non-arising part. This speaks to a very important doctrine in Buddhism known as dependent origination. I'll include a sutra that discusses dependent origination and what it means in the show notes as part of our resources for this week. But the short version is, all things in reality arise due to causes and conditions. There's nothing in reality that you can perceive that didn't occur in reality because of something else. So if you are perceiving microphone, it's because somebody took metal and plastic and made a microphone. And if you're looking at metal and plastic, It's because somebody went to mine some stones and made those stones really hot and melted them down into metal to make the metal pieces. And on and on and on. And the rocks, you look at those because all of the matter condensed from dust in space into a planet that we live on. And that speaks to the fact that not only does everything arise due to causes and conditions, but everything is constantly changing. It's always impermanent. And that speaks to one of the Dharma seals of Buddhism that we discussed in the last episode, which is this impermanence. Nothing exists in a permanent, unchanging way forever. There's nothing that ever goes without being transformed across time.
Okay, so my background is very much in the skeptic camp, and so I'm immediately putting this into like physical chains of reactions. Like, we're talking about the existence of the metal that we're using to make whatever. That was from the, as far as science understands, those metals were created using nuclear fusion in a star.
Correct.
And then those stars happen because of this. And then in science, the question comes back to the Big Bang. And at that point, they're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And yeah, either that or there was nothing before it, which, yeah, that's not a discussion I can particularly get into just because I don't know the physics involved. But yeah, so basically this non-arising dependent origination is cause and effect?
It is, exactly. It is cause and effect. And it's important that you bring up this issue of like, okay, well, if everything has a cause and condition, what is the first cause and condition?
Right. And my understanding is that there really isn't one in Buddhism. Is that right?
That's correct. That's
Gotcha.
correct. There is no first cause and condition. There is just causes and conditions. And the way that they close that loop is by saying that causes and conditions themselves are dhammas, and dhammas arise by causes and conditions. Now, this is a kind of a confusing thing to unpack, and so we can spend a little bit of time on it. But essentially, what it means is that causation doesn't exist with a capital E. Causation is just another dharma, something that we can observe. It's not a law of the universe, a law of nature. It's subject to the laws of the universe and the laws of nature, just like everything else. And to that end, the existence of a cause, or I should say the arising of a cause, is due to itself to other causes. That cause could be the arising of a human consciousness to be able to think about a cause and effect. It could be the condition such as the laws of physics that we are all following all the time. There's any number of things, but it does speak to the fact that emptiness and impermanence themselves don't exist substantially and permanently. They are actually also subject to emptiness and impermanence.
So one day death will die?
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. Everything changes, including change itself. And that's why they call it non-arising. So what I was discussing was arising of phenomena, arising of dharmas. But it's non-arising because there's nothing actually there. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is substantial. Everything is transforming. Nothing is undergoing that impermanent change. And so the most that we get in our lives and our experiences is relative continuity. This relative continuity means that between this second and 5 seconds from now, I will still be a 23-year-old human being. It means that this fall semester, hopefully, I will continue my graduate studies. It means that between now and the next moment, there are some holdovers. It's just that those holdovers are not substantial and permanent in themselves. And things inevitably fall away. In a few months, I'll no longer be a 23-year-old, I'll be a 24-year-old. After this fall and spring semester, I won't be a student of this institution anymore. Everything inevitably changes, even if we do have some amount of relative continuity. And so the Buddha has realized what this means and the implications of this, and has thus realized the implications of non-arising of all dharmas, and has become omniscient.
Okay. Yeah, somewhere in there I got lost, unfortunately. We need to unpack this a bit, I think. So, non-arising speaks to the condition of emptiness. So,
Correct.
Emptiness is I'm reading from a script, folks, just so you're not thinking that I'm figuring this out, actually. I'm trying to unpack what we've got in the script. So, what does emptiness imply in this?
Emptiness implies, it has overlap with the condition of impermanence. So not only does everything change, but also it doesn't have a substantial unchanging existence. Emptiness and impermanence often speak to the same property of things.
I was about to say I'm not understanding how those are different, I guess. Are those the same? Is there some subtleness that I'm missing?
There is a subtle difference, and it's important that you brought it up. Impermanence speaks to the fact of change. It speaks to the fact of, I guess, long-term discontinuity, short-term relative continuity. And emptiness speaks to the fact that if all of this change happens, then there is no such thing as cup, because cup is an arbitrary space that we've made in between the materials of the cup and the remains of the cup. So imagine that you're looking at the entire lifespan of a coffee mug. The entire lifespan starts with dirt and ends with dirt, essentially. And each step in between those are arbitrary categories that our minds have imposed on a smooth continuity. So dirt is a category that we've applied. Ceramic material is a category we've applied. The shape of a coffee mug is a category we've applied. And we convince ourselves and believe deeply in our hearts that at each step, what we are calling that thing is what it is. But if you zoom out from that individual step, you see there is no such thing as cup. There is no such thing as dirt. Because you can't have dirt and cup be the same thing at the same time. That would be a logical fallacy. It would be a paradox that couldn't be reconciled. And therefore, emptiness states that there is no such thing as either one. They are both just arbitrary, empty categories on a smooth continuum of the lifespan of a cup.
All right, well, we've talked about paradoxes, so I'm obviously interested now. So, to me, this is a hard one to get my head around, I guess. So, emptiness, it feels like what we're trying to do here is, in emptiness, we're talking about zooming out, and impermanence is talking about zooming in.
Correct.
Okay, so they're basically, emptiness gives us nothing long-term, and impermanence gives us nothing short-term, and therefore nothing. Is kind of where this is going?
In a sense, yes. But we need to be careful not to fall into a trap that can lead to something called Zen sickness. This trap that I'm talking about is that believing that emptiness implies that nothing exists at all. So because there is no such thing as cup doesn't mean that there isn't a cup on my desk. Because there is no such thing as dirt at all doesn't mean that the building that I'm in is built on nothing. So there are things in the world. It's just that we need to abandon our belief in the categories that we've imposed on those things, because those categories are incomplete representations or misrepresentations of the reality, so to speak.
I see.
Now we're getting into the weeds here, because in Buddhism, if you want to say something like our ideas are misrepresentations of reality, the logical next question is, what is reality? How can we know it? And that's dicey. But the short answer is that another use of the word dharma implies the capital T true reality that is perceivable by human beings, perceivable by living beings, only if they become Buddhas. So this Dharma is able to be realized and perceived if you become a Buddha and become omniscient. And so that's where we get these categories of these concepts of emptiness and impermanence without falling into like fatalism and nihilism and saying that
solipsism.
Solipsism, exactly, that nothing at all exists.
So it's less nothing at all exists and more nothing exists without change.
That's true. That's exactly true. And it's nothing exists as we see it. The way we believe things and the way that things are more distantly related than we tend to believe.
Okay. So to me, that brings the mind of going in with a microscope. Like just microscope on normal materials will show you a lot more detail than we can see. And so, I mean, maybe that's what this is trying to get at, is that you can't know every detail. Am I on the right track, I guess?
Certainly, yeah. You can't know every detail, and you can't predict change in the future, and you can't see change in the past if you're just looking at something in the present. If you perceive something exactly as it is, without any context, of course, you can't see any changes it's undergone. If you look at cup, you can't see dirt. If you look at dirt, you can't see cup. And you can't predict that dirt will become cup. So to that end, you're exactly right. We can't perceive everything all in one moment. We only have our senses to go off of. And we have this really well-evolved mind, really highly sophisticated mind, which imposes patterns and creates categories as a means of making sense of the world. And because we are smart, because we are able to see past those patterns, we should try to. That's kind of the fuel of a young Buddhist monk, I would say. Like someone who hasn't studied the sutras in depth, someone who doesn't have the deepest, most detailed understanding of the Dharma, but is trying to figure out what gets them up every morning to meditate, other than everyone else is doing it, other than he wants to be a Buddha. It's that he knows that there is more than the senses can show him. It's a very Plato type of philosophy, the world of the senses and the world of the forms. And that is actually often compared with this idea of emptiness and impermanence. And
it seems like they're kind of opposite, because my recollection of Plato's deal was that he had the idea of a Platonic solid or a Platonic object that was the ideal thing. And so like you have a Platonic chair that is the most chair a chair can ever chair. But here the Buddha is telling us the exact opposite, that there is no such thing as a chair.
Exactly. They start with the same seed crystal, which is that there is more to the universe than our senses can discuss with us. And they're ending at opposite conclusions. That, the Buddha saying that's because, there is no way our senses could ever show us any of the details, and none of the details really exist because they arise due to causes and conditions, and on and on. And Plato ends up at, that means that the world is incomplete, and then that there is some world that is complete, that is solid. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting overlap between their philosophies and how they got to those conclusions.
Yeah, but now that I have this connection to Platonic solids, I can more easily go, actually, it's the opposite of that. And that helps me understand what that bit of reading that we did earlier that put us how many minutes in the weeds now? Man. Yeah. Okay, but I needed that. So I guess I'm one step closer to being a Buddha now. Awesome. Thank you.
Excellent.
Before we got into that, though, we were talking about Buddha as in the word Buddha, as in the figure Buddha. So let's go back to the original question of who is the Buddha. We've talked about some of the things that he's taught us and that he knew. Let's get back to more simple questions. So the simplest question, I believe, would be, is the Buddha a god?
It's a good question. The short answer is no. Buddhists typically do not view the Buddha as a god. But this is also a pretty weedy question. The longer answer would be that because Buddhists believe in reincarnation of some kind, there are many places or forms in which a person can be reborn when they die. Some of these rebirths do actually include being reborn as a god. So that speaks to the fact that although the Buddha is not a Judeo-Christian god, he's not a creator, he's not omnipotent, there are gods in Buddhism. However, these gods can die. These gods are mortal, and they are also incomplete, flawed individuals. You can think of the Greek pantheon. The Greek pantheon often do have, in the myths, very human characteristics, such as hubris and pride and jealousy and things like that. Gods in Buddhism also have that. In Buddhism, in the type of Buddhism that I study, called Mahayana Buddhism, I would say the most popular type of Buddhism in East Asia, they count 6 realms of rebirth. Usually 6, sometimes 10, sometimes more. But in order from the worst rebirth to the highest rebirth, they include hell dwellers. There's a hell in Buddhism. Hungry ghosts, animals, humans, jealous gods, and higher gods. Now you'll notice something interesting. You might be wondering, why is not Buddha on that list? Can't you be reborn as a Buddha? And the answer is no, you actually can't be reborn as a Buddha. You can only attain Buddhahood while you're alive. And attaining Buddhahood, one of the critical, most important characteristics of attaining Buddhahood is actually dying. So this is often misunderstood by a lot of people, what it means to be a Buddha and attain nirvana. Nirvana is a word that gets passed around a lot in the West and in self-help books and in Western philosophy books. And this is something that I would be glad to discuss and perhaps remedy some of these incorrect interpretations.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have to do an entire episode about nirvana at some point.
Absolutely, yeah. The short version is that nirvana is cognate with a word that translates in Sanskrit to blowing out, like a flame that has been blown out. And to that end, part of attaining nirvana is no longer existing in the cycle of birth and rebirth. And the best approximation that we have for what that means is actually being fully dead and never coming back, as opposed to being dead and being reborn as an animal, a jealous god, a hell dweller, a human, etc.
Okay. This is not in the show notes, so this is an off-the-weeds question, but I've been told in some traditions there actually are folks who attain enlightenment and then voluntarily come back. I've been told that's called the bodhisattva.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So that rule of not coming back is negotiable, it sounds like?
That's correct, yeah. Because someone has attained omniscience when they become enlightened, that means that they can hold off their very last stage, their very last nirvana. This is called the peri-nirvana, with the prefix P-A-R-I, meaning like complete nirvana.
Gotcha.
And they do this because they have this extreme generosity and extreme love for all sentient beings, every being in any of these 6 realms that I discussed. And they want to ensure the salvation and the enlightenment and nirvana of all of those beings before they reach their final nirvana. That is related to the name Mahayana for this type of Buddhism. The bodhisattvas you bring up are very, very popular in Mahayana Buddhism as an ideal to strive for in this life and as an object of worship and ritual.
I've heard them compared to saints in Judeo-Christian.
They are comparable to saints, yeah. They are very comparable to saints. And what is special about them is that instead of just attaining enlightenment or nirvana just only for themselves, they have widened their scope, widened their vehicle for everybody. And that speaks to the name of Mahayana. Maha means large or great, and yana means vehicle. So
Yeah, okay.
Mahayana Buddhism, which includes Zen, includes Yogacara, which includes Tiantai, lots of different types of Buddhism in East Asia. This is striving for that ideal for enlightenment for everybody, not just for the individual.
Cool. Let's clarify one last thing, and I think we'll almost have an episode done. The last question we have to clarify here is there more than one Buddha? Which, through our discussions, we've kind of already answered.
Yes, we have discussed this, and yes, there are infinite Buddhas. Anybody who has attained enlightenment in all eternity, past, present, and future, is a Buddha. When it comes to the Buddha that we're commonly referring to is the historical one, known as Siddhartha Gautama, the prince we talked about in the previous episode. He is the historical Buddha because he's the one we have record of. But the canon, the sutras, the texts allude to many more Buddhas. These include popular bodhisattvas like Amitabha, Maitreya, Avalokiteshvara, Mahastamaprapta, Samantabhadra, many others. These Buddhas are popular in their own right as objects of veneration, doctrine, ritual, and meditation. And that said, in all of recorded human history, there has only been one Buddha at a time, or no Buddha at all. So we're in a place in our history, according to Mahayana Buddhists, where we remember the teachings of the historical Buddha a little bit, but a long time has passed since he died. When we have completely forgotten his teachings, when there are no more Buddhists, there is no more community, and the teachings have been all forgotten or misrepresented or have decayed beyond repair, it is said that Maitreya, or the Buddha of the future, will be born in this world and will preach the Dharma again. In this case, the word Dharma means the doctrine of Buddhism, the doctrine of the non-arising of all Dharmas. So there are infinite Buddhas. There's rules about how many there can be, or I should say unspoken rules about how many there can be at one time. And we're destined for one whenever we forget the teachings of the historical Buddha.
So it'll all come back in the end anyway.
Absolutely. And it will happen that way infinitely until every sentient being has attained enlightenment. Until every single sentient being has attained full nirvana, there will continue to be a new Buddha, and then a cycle where we forget all of the Buddha's teachings, and then a new Buddha after that, and on and on and on. This is called the Dharma wheel. This cycle is called the Dharma wheel, and our historical Buddha is the first turner of the Dharma wheel. Maitreya will turn it again, and whoever comes after Maitreya will turn it again, and on and on and on until it doesn't have to be turned anymore.
That's a very optimistic note to end on, I think.
I think so too.
All right. So, I hope that was helpful. I certainly learned a lot from doing this. Part of why I'm on here is because a lot of this material is going to be new to me. So I can do the part of like, wait, what does that mean? Because the first time I read this script, it was like, oh, this is going to be bad. I'm not going to be able to talk about any of this. But we got through it.
I think so, yeah. And I hope that you learned a lot, and I hope our listeners learned a lot as well.
I certainly did. So, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you. And join us next week for our next episode where we discuss questions such as, what are the fundamental beliefs of Buddhism? Does Buddhism have a Bible like Christianity? Does Buddhism have an afterlife? And other questions like that.
We'll see you then. Well, you'll hear us then.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.